The geopolitical tension hung heavy over the Middle East in March of 2003, an invisible weight pressing down on the arid expanse. The suffocating atmosphere peaked as the roar of heavily modified engines was swallowed entirely by the unforgiving darkness of the western Iraqi desert. Captain Thomas gripped the steering wheel of his long-range patrol vehicle, staring into the pitch blackness that represented the boundary between life and death. The starting line of this clandestine operation was drawn in sand and absolute secrecy, marking the beginning of a relentless phantom insertion. They had crossed the Jordanian border under the cover of a moonless sky, moving like specters across the hostile, undulating terrain. Stripped of all traditional illumination, the Australian Special Air Service Regiment operators relied entirely on advanced night vision goggles to navigate the treacherous landscape. The green-tinted world revealed hidden ravines, jagged rock formations, and unpredictable dunes that threatened to overturn their heavily laden vehicles at any moment. Every soldier understood the gravity of their silent infiltration, knowing that a single miscalculation or mechanical failure would compromise the entire coalition strategy before the war even officially began. The biting cold of the desert night pierced through their specialized tactical gear, a stark contrast to the blistering heat they knew would follow at dawn. Sergeant Miller, a seasoned reconnaissance expert and survival master, sat in the passenger seat with his weapon ready, his eyes constantly scanning the shifting shadows. "Keep the RPM low, Thomas. We cannot afford an echo in this canyon," Miller whispered harshly into his throat microphone, his voice a mere vibration. The captain offered a curt nod, his focus undivided as he gently eased the accelerator, maintaining their ghostly, methodical progression eastward. Corporal Davies monitored the electronic warfare systems from the rear compartment, surrounded by a complex array of encrypted radios and signal jammers. The strict radio silence protocol meant he could only listen, analyzing the invisible spectrum of frequencies for any sign of Iraqi border patrols. His fingers moved deftly over the glowing dials, shielding the faint luminescence beneath a thick, dark tarp to prevent any accidental light discipline breach. The deep silence of the desert was deceptive, masking a highly alert enemy infrastructure that actively scoured the vast wastelands for any indication of Western military incursions. Their primary objective was to penetrate deep behind enemy lines undetected, laying the groundwork for the incoming conventional forces. They were hunters tracking down elusive strategic targets, specifically the mobile Scud missile launchers, capable of striking neighboring allied nations. The psychological burden of operating without conventional logistical support or immediate air extraction weighed heavily on the patrol, yet their rigorous training kept their minds razor-sharp. They were the tip of the spear, pushing through the hostile void where one wrong turn could lead them directly into a heavily fortified Iraqi Republican Guard encampment. Hours bled into one another as the small convoy navigated the intricate wadi systems, using the dry riverbeds to mask their physical and thermal signatures. The rough terrain relentlessly battered their bodies, but no one uttered a single complaint, their professionalism superseding the intense physical discomfort. Thomas meticulously checked their GPS coordinates against his physical map, a necessary redundancy in an environment where electronic systems could fail without warning. The vast emptiness of the western desert was a tactical advantage, but it also offered zero cover if an enemy aerial patrol happened to pass overhead. The tension inside the lead vehicle spiked abruptly when Davies tapped twice on the metal roll bar, the designated physical signal for immediate halt. Thomas depressed the clutch, bringing the heavy patrol vehicle to a smooth, silent stop behind a massive limestone outcropping. "I have anomalous signal activity," Davies murmured, leaning closer to the captain and sergeant so his voice wouldn't carry. "Unidentified radar emissions sweeping our sector, moving laterally across our current formation path." Miller immediately raised his thermal optics, scanning the designated horizon for any corresponding heat signatures that might reveal the threat. The sweeping radar signal indicated a sophisticated mobile detection unit, an unexpected variable that contradicted their pre-mission intelligence briefings. They were supposed to be in a blind spot, a desolate sector deemed too barren for permanent enemy sensor placements. "Can you triangulate the source?" Davies asked Thomas, his voice steady despite the sudden spike in adrenaline flooding his system. "Negative, sir. The signal is intermittent and bouncing off the canyon walls, making it impossible to pinpoint a precise origin vector," Davies replied, his eyes locked onto the digital cascade of information illuminating his small screen. They sat in agonizing silence for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the invisible electronic net to either pass over them or tighten. The desert wind began to pick up, swirling fine sand into the air and degrading the effectiveness of their night vision equipment. Miller kept his thermal scope trained on the ridgeline, knowing that if the Iraqi patrol crested that hill, they would be silhouetted and completely exposed. Their orders strictly forbade engaging the enemy during the insertion phase, making evasion their only viable, yet highly precarious, tactical option in this situation. Gradually, the hostile radar sweeps became less frequent, the electronic pulses fading into the background static of the vast desert environment. "Signal is dissipating, Captain. Looks like they are moving north, away from our current position," Davies reported, letting out a slow, controlled breath. Thomas didn't relax his grip on the steering wheel, well aware that a secondary patrol could be trailing the first in complete silence. "Understood. We maintain position for another 15 minutes before resuming the advance. We cannot risk driving into a delayed ambush," Thomas ordered, demonstrating his characteristic ironclad tactical discipline. When they finally resumed their eastward push, the terrain grew even more treacherous, transitioning from flat, hard-packed dirt to treacherous, shifting sands. The specialized tires of their vehicles struggled to find traction, threatening to bog down the heavily armored trucks in the unforgiving dunes. Miller frequently dismounted, walking ahead of the convoy to physically test the ground's stability and guide the vehicles through the safest possible routes. This agonizingly slow progress ate into their precious timetable, increasing the risk that they might be caught out in the open when the sun inevitably rose. The physical exhaustion began to set in, a creeping fatigue that threatened to dull their senses and slow their reaction times in a crisis. They had been awake for over 30 hours, fueled only by adrenaline, caffeine, and an unyielding commitment to their highly classified mission objectives. Despite the grueling conditions, the discipline of the SASR operators never wavered, their movements remaining precise, calculated, and entirely devoid of any wasted energy. They were a cohesive unit, a single organism moving through the hostile landscape with a shared purpose and an unbreakable bond forged in hardship. As they pushed deeper into Iraqi territory, the landscape began to change, the empty desert giving way to scattered rocky outcrops and deep, winding canyons. These geographical features provided excellent concealment from aerial surveillance, but they also created dangerous choke points where an enemy ambush would be devastatingly effective. Thomas navigated these narrow passes with extreme caution, relying heavily on Miller's acute situational awareness to detect any signs of recent human activity. Every disturbed pebble, every unnatural shadow was scrutinized, their survival depending entirely on their ability to read the subtle language of the desert terrain. The cold deepened as the night progressed, freezing the moisture from their breaths to the lower edges of their protective balaclavas. This harsh environment was indifferent to their political affiliations or military objectives, serving as an impartial adversary that constantly tested their physical endurance. They consumed high-calorie rations in complete darkness, eating mechanically without taking their eyes off the designated sectors of fire they were actively guarding. It was a surreal existence, suspended in a dark, freezing void, where the only reality was the mission and the men sitting right next to them. By 0400 hours, they had successfully penetrated nearly 50 miles past the heavily fortified international border without triggering a single alarm. It was a monumental achievement in stealth navigation, a testament to their rigorous training and the sophisticated technology enabling their clandestine movement. However, the deepest parts of the enemy territory still lay ahead, holding unknown dangers and sophisticated defense networks detailed only in vague intelligence estimates. They were ghosts haunting a landscape preparing for an imminent, massive conventional war, tasked with shaping the battlefield before the main invasion force even arrived. The communication window for their scheduled sitrep, or situational report, approached, requiring a delicate balance of technical skill and tactical security. Davies prepared the highly directional satellite antenna, ensuring it was precisely aimed to minimize the risk of their encrypted transmission being intercepted locally. "Transmitting burst data now," Davies whispered, sending the heavily compressed, encrypted file containing their current coordinates and operational status to the Coalition Command Center. The transmission lasted only a fraction of a second, an invisible pulse of information shooting into the upper atmosphere, instantly disappearing into the vast digital ether. The successful transmission provided a brief moment of psychological relief, a tenuous connection to the massive military apparatus waiting just across the border. Yet, this connection also served as a stark reminder of their profound physical isolation, operating entirely alone in a vast, hostile expanse of desert. Thomas checked the digital compass mounted on the dashboard, confirming their heading as they navigated out of a deep ravine and onto an elevated plateau. Adjusting course 3 degrees north, we need to bypass a suspected nomadic encampment spotted on the latest satellite imagery, he informed the team quietly. The plateau offered a faster rate of travel, but it severely compromised their visual cover, exposing their silhouettes against the starlit desert sky. They increased their speed, racing against the approaching dawn, the powerful engines humming a low, steady rhythm that vibrated through the floorboards. Miller kept his weapon trained on the horizon, his night vision goggles painting the barren landscape in stark, high-contrast shades of bright green. Every slight variation in the terrain was instantly analyzed for potential threats, their minds operating at maximum processing capacity despite the overwhelming bone-deep exhaustion. We have less than 2 hours before first light. Captain, we need to locate a secure hide site to weather the coming daylight hours, Miller advised. The transition from night to day was the most vulnerable period for a special reconnaissance patrol, requiring absolute stillness to avoid visual detection. Thomas agreed, scanning the digital topographic map for a suitable location, finally identifying a cluster of deep wadis that offered adequate overhead concealment. Coordinates locked, heading for the primary hide site now. Maintain visual scanning. We cannot afford any surprises this close to our resting position, he commanded. As they approached the designated hide site, the terrain became incredibly rugged, requiring precise, technical driving to navigate the steep, rocky inclines. They carefully maneuvered the vehicles into the deepest part of the wadi, pulling camouflage netting tightly over the metallic surfaces to break up their outlines. Every man moved with practiced efficiency, sweeping away their tire tracks using specialized brooms to erase any physical evidence of their clandestine arrival. Within minutes, the heavily armed patrol vehicles were completely swallowed by the desert landscape, rendered virtually invisible to anyone not standing directly on top of them. The team quickly established a defensive perimeter, setting up claymore mines and motion sensors to protect their hidden encampment during the vulnerable daylight hours. Davies initiated the electronic countermeasure protocols, deploying passive sensors to monitor the surrounding radio frequency environment without emitting any detectable signals. We are secure, Captain. Environmental sensors are green and the perimeter is officially locked down, Miller reported, taking his position at the primary observation post. Thomas nodded, taking the first watch schedule, allowing his exhausted men a few precious hours of sleep before the intense desert heat made rest impossible. The first rays of the morning sun began to breach the eastern horizon, painting the vast Iraqi desert in brilliant shades of orange and gold. From their concealed position, they watched the hostile landscape slowly wake up, the shadows retreating to reveal the harsh, unforgiving reality of their surroundings. Suddenly, a high-pitched electronic whine pierced the quiet interior of the hide site, causing every man to instantly reach for their primary weapon systems. Davies scrambled toward the radio console, his face pale under the camouflage paint as he frantically manipulated the frequency tuning dials. "Sir, we have a massive problem. Our primary encrypted communication suite is experiencing catastrophic, full-spectrum jamming across all designated operational frequencies," Davies reported urgently. This wasn't a random anomaly, it was a deliberate, highly sophisticated electronic attack, indicating that an enemy electronic warfare unit was operating nearby. Thomas moved to the console, his expression grim as he analyzed the rapidly cascading error messages flashing violently across the small tactical display screens. They were 50 miles deep into hostile territory, completely cut off from the coalition command, and entirely blind to the enemy movements surrounding them. The sudden loss of communication drastically altered their tactical reality, instantly transforming a covert reconnaissance mission into a desperate struggle for operational survival. "Shut down all active receivers. Davies, we cannot risk them triangulating our exact position by tracing the electronic handshake attempts," Thomas ordered decisively. The silence that followed was deafening, a heavy, oppressive blanket that isolated them completely from the outside world and the massive invasion force. They were now truly phantoms in the desert, operating without a safety net, forced to rely entirely on their own lethal instincts to survive. The mission parameters had instantly dissolved into chaos, leaving the small Australian team completely alone in the heart of the Iraqi Western Desert. The highly anticipated invasion had not yet officially begun, but for Captain Thomas and his isolated patrol, the brutal reality of war had already arrived. The blinding morning sun beat down on their camouflage netting, heating the hidden ravine as they prepared to face an unseen, technologically advanced adversary. The invisible insertion was over. They were now officially stranded behind enemy lines, surrounded by hostile forces, and waiting anxiously in the terrifying darkness of total radio silence. The blistering Iraqi sun rapidly transformed their concealed wadi into a suffocating, inescapable oven by mid-morning. Temperatures soared past 120 degrees Fahrenheit, threatening to melt the sensitive electronics and turning the heavily armored patrol vehicles into scorching metal traps. Captain Thomas watched sweat pool beneath his tactical goggles, realizing the oppressive heat was actively degrading their thermal camouflage netting. This brutal environmental assault was an invisible enemy, silently compromising their stealth as the eerie, absolute quiet of the surrounding desert amplified their profound sense of isolation. Hydration protocols are strictly enforced. We cannot afford heat casualties this far behind enemy lines, Thomas whispered, passing a warm canteen to his second-in-command. Sergeant Miller nodded grimly, his eyes never leaving the high-powered optical scope trained on the shimmering horizon where heat waves distorted the barren landscape. The constant threat of discovery gnawed at their nerves, especially since their communication systems remained entirely dead, paralyzed by the unknown jamming signal. Every shifting shadow or sudden gust of wind carrying abrasive sand felt like a potential prelude to a devastating Iraqi ambush. Their primary directive remained unchanged despite the terrifying communications blackout, forcing them to continue hunting for the elusive Scud missile launchers. These mobile ballistic platforms represented a nightmare scenario for coalition commanders, capable of delivering devastating chemical or biological payloads to neighboring countries. Finding them in this vast, featureless wasteland was like searching for a needle in a continent-sized haystack, requiring immense patience and unparalleled tracking skills. The team understood that failing this critical objective could instantly trigger a catastrophic regional escalation, costing countless innocent civilian lives across the entire Middle Eastern theater. As dusk finally began to paint the desert sky in bruised shades of purple, the paralyzing heat slowly released its suffocating grip on the trapped operators. They meticulously packed away their daytime concealment, preparing the patrol vehicles for another grueling night of silent, completely unlit navigation through the treacherous terrain. The sudden drop in temperature was violently sharp, replacing the threat of heat stroke with the biting, bone-chilling cold that characterized the harsh western Iraqi desert nights. Thomas signaled the advance, their engines purring softly as they crept out of the protective wadi into the exposed open ground. Navigating solely by the green glow of their night vision equipment, the SASR patrol methodically scoured the intricate network of dry riverbeds and rocky canyons. These geographical depressions were the logical hiding spots for the massive, cumbersome missile launchers, offering natural protection against coalition aerial reconnaissance sweeps. Corporal Davies continuously monitored the passive electronic sensors, hoping the enemy jamming had ceased, but the digital displays offered nothing but hostile static. This absolute electronic isolation forced them to rely entirely on ancient tracking techniques, reading the physical environment for any subtle disturbances left by heavy machinery. Around midnight, Sergeant Miller signaled for a sudden halt, raising his clenched fist as he stared intently at the ground illuminated by his infrared headlamp. He dismounted his vehicle with practiced silence, crouching low to examine a series of massive, unnatural depressions carved deeply into the hard-packed desert floor. "Captain, you need to see this immediately," Miller murmured, his voice tight with an undeniable mixture of professional intrigue and sudden apprehension. Thomas joined him, tracing the heavy tread marks that clearly did not belong to any standard Iraqi military transport or civilian logistical vehicle known to Allied intelligence. These are multi-axle tire impressions, widely spaced, indicating a massive load-bearing chassis designed specifically for extreme off-road military deployment, Miller explained, measuring the exact width. The sheer size of the tracks sent a sudden chill down Thomas's spine as they perfectly matched the classified profiles of the Russian-built transporter erector launchers. They had finally discovered a tangible ghost in the machine, a physical confirmation that the apocalyptic weapons they were hunting were actively moving through this exact sector. The hunters had found their elusive prey's trail, but following it blindly in the dark could easily lead them into a lethal trap. Operating under extreme caution, the patrol began to slowly follow the massive tire tracks, their tactical formation tight and weapons instinctively pointed toward the dark horizons. The trail weaved erratically through a particularly dense cluster of towering sandstone pillars, indicating the enemy driver was deliberately utilizing the terrain to mask their movement from above. Davies kept his eyes glued to the silent electronic warfare console, praying for a momentary lapse in the enemy's jamming protocol so they could transmit these critical coordinates. Until that connection was restored, this highly classified discovery remained locked entirely within the minds of three isolated men. The deeper they followed the heavy tracks into the labyrinth of sandstone, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. The towering rock formations blocked the ambient starlight, plunging the Australian operators into a profound darkness that even their advanced night vision goggles struggled to effectively pierce. Check your corners. This terrain is a textbook environment for a devastating close-quarters ambush, Thomas warned his team, his grip tightening around his suppressed assault rifle. Every loose pebble that tumbled down the steep canyon walls sounded like a deafening explosion in the highly charged, absolute silence. After 3 agonizing hours of methodical tracking, the heavy tire impressions abruptly ended near the base of a massive, seemingly impenetrable limestone cliff face. Miller signaled for the vehicles to remain hidden behind a jagged outcropping while he and Thomas proceeded on foot to conduct a close reconnaissance of the immediate area. They crawled forward on their stomachs, using the uneven ground to break their silhouettes, their senses hyper-tuned to detect the slightest scent of diesel exhaust or human presence. The tracks didn't just vanish, they appeared to drive directly into the solid rock, a geographical impossibility that instantly raised several tactical red flags. Thomas slowly raised his high-resolution thermal imaging binoculars, sweeping the cliff base to identify any unnatural heat signatures bleeding through the seemingly solid rock face. What he witnessed next shattered their pre-mission intelligence briefings entirely, sending a massive surge of adrenaline directly into his already exhausted bloodstream. He didn't just see the faint thermal outline of a single Scud launcher hidden under camouflage netting. He saw the unmistakable thermal vents of a massive underground complex. Miller, look at grid reference alpha. This isn't just a temporary hiding spot. We have stumbled upon a fully fortified subterranean installation, Thomas whispered urgently. Through the thermal optics, the scope of the hidden Iraqi facility became terrifyingly clear, glowing with the intense heat of heavy generators and active life support systems. The rock face was a cleverly disguised, hydraulically operated blast door, large enough to easily accommodate multiple ballistic missile transporters simultaneously. Armed sentries were visible, patrolling a concealed trench network surrounding the entrance, their body heat radiating brightly against the cold background of the nighttime desert. This was a strategic command and control center, a high-value target that far exceeded their initial expectations and drastically compounded the immediate danger to their small team. I count at least 40 heavily armed hostile personnel on the perimeter alone, equipped with heavy machine guns and interlocking fields of defensive fire, Miller reported precisely. The Australian operators were vastly outnumbered and completely outgunned, possessing only their personal weapons and a limited supply of explosives meant for sabotage, not a frontal assault. Engaging this fortified position directly would be a tactical suicide mission, ending in their immediate destruction and the permanent loss of this critical intelligence data. Their only viable option was to gather as much observational data as possible and somehow find a way to break through the communications jamming. Thomas crawled backward slowly, rejoining Davies at the hidden patrol vehicles to formulate a desperate plan to alert the Coalition High Command about this massive threat. Davies, I need a secure transmission window. No matter the cost, we must get these exact coordinates to the bomber squadrons before those Scuds launch, the captain demanded. The corporal furiously typed commands into his terminal, trying to bypass the electronic blockade by utilizing a highly experimental, ultra-high-frequency burst transmission protocol. I can attempt to punch a microsecond signal through the interference, sir, but it will instantly pinpoint our exact location to their electronic warfare units, Davies warned. This was the excruciating reality of special operations, constantly balancing the immediate survival of the team against the overarching strategic success of the entire military campaign. If Davies transmitted the coordinates, The Iraqi garrison would immediately swarm their position, turning the quiet desert canyon into a chaotic, bloody last stand for the Australians. However, remaining silent meant those ballistic missiles could be fueled and launched into neighboring civilian populations without any warning, causing unimaginable destruction and massive geopolitical fallout. Prepare the burst transmission. Corporal, we didn't cross this border just to watch the world burn from a safe distance, Thomas ordered resolutely. The team frantically repositioned their heavily armed vehicles to establish a defensive perimeter, anticipating the violent enemy response that would undoubtedly follow their electronic broadcast. Miller carefully placed the remaining anti-personnel mines along the most likely avenues of approach, transforming their narrow canyon hideout into a lethal, carefully constructed kill zone. Every operator checked their ammunition reserves and ensured their secondary weapons were fully loaded, mentally preparing themselves for the overwhelming odds they were about to face. The oppressive silence of the desert felt heavier now, pregnant with the terrifying anticipation of the intense violence that was merely seconds away from erupting. Coordinates encrypted, targeting data locked, sending the burst transmission in 3, 2, 1. Mark, Davies whispered, slamming his finger down on the glowing execute key. A microscopic pulse of heavily encrypted data shot into the night sky, fighting through the thick layers of electronic jamming to reach the coalition satellite network. Instantly, the hostile radar detectors in their vehicles screamed in alarm, indicating that the Iraqi electronic warfare operators had detected their brief signal and were triangulating their position. The Phantom team was no longer invisible. They had intentionally illuminated themselves on the enemy's radar to ensure the destruction of the subterranean base. The reaction from the hidden Iraqi facility was immediate and violently aggressive, exactly as Captain Thomas had anticipated when he authorized the dangerous communication burst. Massive diesel engines roared to life inside the mountain, the sound echoing ominously through the canyon as the heavy blast doors began to slowly grind open. Floodlights violently pierced the darkness, sweeping the surrounding desert landscape as heavily armed reaction forces poured out of the bunker, searching frantically for the source of the transmission. The Australian operators held their breath, their weapons raised, watching the overwhelming enemy force mobilize just a few hundred yards from their fragile defensive perimeter. Their survival now depended entirely on how quickly the coalition air force could process the targeting data and deliver a devastating payload to the precise coordinates. They needed a miracle in the form of stealth bombers, flying high above the atmosphere to rain down precision-guided munitions before the Iraqi infantry discovered their location. Time to target estimation is unknown. Sir, we just have to hold this line and pray the message made it through the interference, Davies reported quietly. Mervyn 1, we too bien city. The tension was agonizing, a physical weight that compressed their chests as they watched the enemy search parties inching methodically closer to their hidden wadi position. Suddenly, the low, rhythmic thud of an approaching heavy armored vehicle vibrated through the ground, shaking the very foundation of their carefully concealed observation post. An Iraqi mechanized infantry patrol, detached from the main base, was rolling directly toward their flank, their heavy-caliber weapons mounted and ready for immediate action. The shadows danced wildly as the enemy vehicle's searchlight cut across the rock formations, the beam of light stopping mere inches from where Sergeant Miller was crouched. The hunters had officially become the hunted, completely trapped between a fortified mountain base and a heavily armed patrol, with absolutely nowhere left to run. The earth trembled violently beneath their camouflaged bodies as a massive Iraqi armored convoy thundered down the strategic highway mere meters away. The deafening roar of diesel engines and the aggressive clanking of heavy tank treads threatened to shatter their eardrums, vibrating through the shallow depression where the Australian operators lay perfectly still. They were practically breathing the pungent exhaust fumes of the enemy war machine, entirely buried under specialized thermal netting and desert sand. A single cough or a sudden metallic clink from their tactical gear would instantly invite a devastating barrage of heavy machine gun fire. Having narrowly escaped the subterranean missile complex, Captain Thomas had immediately redirected his exhausted patrol to establish this highly classified observation post. Their new objective was to systematically monitor this critical logistical artery, silently cataloging the movement of Iraqi Republican Guard units rushing toward the front line. They operated in a state of absolute, unbreakable radio silence, utilizing passive optical sensors to avoid triggering any nearby electronic warfare detection units. The sheer volume of enemy armor rolling past their hidden position confirmed that a massive, coordinated counteroffensive was actively being mobilized against the incoming coalition forces. The brutal reality of this static reconnaissance mission quickly took a severe physical toll on the isolated Special Forces team. Operating within inches of a hostile army required a level of psychological endurance and physical discipline that pushed the absolute limits of human capability. They could not stand up, stretch their cramped muscles, or consume their combat rations without risking immediate visual detection by the sentries posted on the passing vehicles. The scorching daytime heat baked the ground beneath them, turning their concealed observation hideout into a suffocating, dust-filled oven that relentlessly drained their remaining energy. 72 agonizing hours had passed since the Australian operators had last experienced any meaningful sleep, and the profound exhaustion was becoming a dangerous enemy. Sergeant Miller kept his bloodshot eyes glued to the high-powered optical spotting scope, his vision occasionally blurring as his brain desperately fought against the overwhelming urge to shut down. He forced himself to blink rapidly, aggressively chewing on a piece of dried military gum to stimulate his senses and maintain his critical focus. The relentless procession of enemy troop transports and armored personnel carriers blurred into an endless, mind-numbing stream of hostile military hardware. Corporal Davies lay silently beside his commander, meticulously logging the detailed convoy composition data onto a ruggedized digital tablet with agonizingly slow, deliberate finger movements. The physical stiffness in his joints was excruciating, a direct result of remaining entirely motionless in the freezing night temperatures and the blistering midday sun. He relied on specialized hydration tubes woven directly into his tactical vest to take tiny, measured sips of warm water, ensuring no sudden movements disrupted their camouflage. Every recorded piece of intelligence was a vital puzzle piece for the coalition command, justifying their tremendous physical suffering in this hostile environment. The arrival of dusk brought a slight drop in the oppressive temperature, but it simultaneously introduced a completely new set of severe tactical challenges. The darkness provided better visual concealment. Yet the Iraqi convoys began utilizing powerful thermal imaging scanners and heavy infrared spotlights to secure the highway perimeter. Captain Thomas monitored these sweeping beams of invisible light, perfectly aware that their specialized netting was the only barrier preventing their immediate, violent execution. "Keep your heads down and breathe shallowly. Those thermal sensors can pick up the heat from an exhaled breath at this close range," Thomas warned silently. This claustrophobic existence forced the men to confront the profound psychological isolation of operating entirely alone deep within heavily fortified enemy territory. They were silent witnesses to the massive scale of the Iraqi military mobilization, observing thousands of heavily armed soldiers preparing to engage their coalition brothers. The overwhelming urge to act, to call in a devastating airstrike on the densely packed convoys, was constantly suppressed by the strict strategic necessity of remaining hidden. Their primary mission was intelligence gathering, requiring them to suppress their aggressive combat instincts and embrace the agonizing role of passive, invisible observers. Maintaining this extreme level of tactical discipline required an unbreakable trust among the small, isolated team of highly trained Australian operators. When Miller's eyes finally began to fail him after hours of unbroken observation, Thomas seamlessly slid into position to relieve the exhausted scout. They communicated primarily through subtle hand gestures and meaningful eye contact, a silent language forged through years of rigorous training and shared battlefield trauma. This seamless coordination ensured that their vital observation post remained fully operational and completely undetected, despite the severe physical and mental degradation they were actively experiencing. As the fourth consecutive day of their covert observation mission slowly dawned, a thick, suffocating dust storm violently swept across the western Iraqi highway. The abrasive sand effectively blinded the enemy drivers and forced the massive armored convoys to drastically reduce their speed, creating a massive logistical bottleneck. While the storm provided excellent temporary cover from visual detection, the howling wind threatened to completely tear away their carefully positioned camouflage netting. The team had to physically anchor the edges of their concealment with their own bodies, bearing the full brunt of the stinging, high-velocity desert sand. The sudden shift in environmental conditions tested their resilience, burying their weapons and tactical gear under a thick, gritty layer of fine desert dust. Every mechanical component required immediate, meticulous cleaning to ensure operational readiness, a nearly impossible task while strictly maintaining their prone, hidden positions. Davies carefully shielded the fragile electronic communication equipment with his own body, knowing that the fine sand could easily short-circuit their only lifeline to the coalition command. The storm eventually passed, leaving behind a deceptively calm atmosphere that completely masked the imminent, life-altering crisis rapidly approaching their concealed position. The tactical situation deteriorated instantly when a small flock of scrawny desert goats suddenly wandered away from the main highway and toward their hideout. The animals grazed aimlessly on the sparse, dry vegetation, their hooves kicking up small blue clouds of dust as they slowly encroached upon the observation post. Thomas felt a sudden, icy knot of pure dread form in his stomach, realizing that local nomadic herders almost always closely followed their wandering livestock. This was the ultimate nightmare scenario for a covert reconnaissance team, a completely unpredictable civilian element threatening to shatter their carefully constructed illusion of emptiness. A young Iraqi boy, perhaps no older than 12, emerged slowly from the shimmering heat haze, gently guiding his herd with a long wooden stick. He was completely oblivious to the massive geopolitical conflict surrounding him, focusing entirely on gathering his stray animals near the edge of the shallow depression. The child's erratic path brought him terrifyingly close to the hidden operators, his worn sandals stepping carelessly over the rocks just a few feet away. Sergeant Miller froze entirely, his hand slowly and silently gripping the handle of his combat knife as the boy continued his unhurried approach. The young goat herder suddenly paused, his dark eyes squinting suspiciously at the unnatural mound of sand and netting concealing the heavily armed Australian scout. He stood exactly 2 steps away from Miller's camouflaged face, close enough for the operator to hear the boy's soft, rhythmic breathing in the quiet air. This was the terrifying moral line of special operations warfare, a devastating ethical dilemma completely absent from any standard military tactical manual. To shoot the child meant instantly exposing their position to the massive Iraqi convoy currently idling on the highway just 50 meters behind the boy. Conversely, if they allowed the boy to walk away, he would undoubtedly inform the nearby military patrols about the foreigners hiding in the dirt. That single piece of civilian intelligence would quickly bring a heavily armed Iraqi battalion down upon them, resulting in the team's brutal execution. Thomas watched the horrific scenario unfold through his optical scope, his finger resting lightly on the trigger of his suppressed rifle, desperately weighing the impossible options. The lives of his men and the strategic success of the entire coalition campaign were suddenly balanced against the life of an innocent child. The boy took one more tentative step forward, raising his wooden stick to curiously poke at the edge of the highly advanced thermal camouflage netting. Time seemed to stop completely as Miller slowly drew his blade, his heart pounding violently against his ribs as he prepared to do the unthinkable. The strict rules of engagement offered no clear guidance for this specific, heartbreaking tragedy, leaving the ultimate, devastating decision resting squarely on their exhausted shoulders. They were ghosts haunting the desert, but in this terrifying fraction of a second, the harsh reality of war demanded a deeply human choice. A suffocating tension gripped the small team as the wooden stick hovered mere millimeters above the fabric that separated them from absolute, catastrophic failure. "Hold your strike, Miller. Let him make the next move. We do not engage a civilian unless compromised entirely," Thomas commanded through a tight, breathless whisper. The child hesitated, his gaze shifting from the strange mound back to a bleeding goat that had wandered further down the rocky desert slope. Lowering his stick, the young boy slowly turned his back on the hidden soldiers, unknowingly sparing his own life and the lives of the Phantom Patrol. The deafening explosion of the first coalition smart bombs violently shattered the unnatural silence of the western desert, marking the brutal commencement of their assault on the massive Al-Assad airbase. This fiery spectacle painted the dark horizon in terrifying shades of crimson and orange, signaling the start of a highly classified, deadly performance. Captain Thomas watched the shockwaves ripple across the barren landscape, knowing their small, isolated special operations team was about to orchestrate the destruction of a massive fortress. They were no longer mere observers, they had actively transitioned into the violent role of frontline offensive coordinators. Their new, incredibly ambitious objective was to completely paralyze the strategic airfield using highly coordinated close air support and relentless, high-mobility mechanized guerrilla warfare tactics. The Australian operators needed to project an overwhelming psychological presence, convincing the thousands of entrenched Iraqi defenders that a massive coalition armored division was actively surrounding their perimeter. This audacious deception required the team to move constantly around the vast compound, calling in devastating precision airstrikes from multiple, rapidly changing vantage points. Operating under the cover of night, the heavily armed patrol vehicles maneuvered aggressively through the treacherous, sandy terrain surrounding the sprawling military complex. Target Package Alpha is painted and brightly illuminated. Authorize immediate weapons release on those hardened aircraft shelters. Corporal Davies commanded into his encrypted radio handset, communicating directly with the circling bomber squadrons. Within seconds, another series of earth-shattering detonations violently leveled the concrete bunkers, sending massive plumes of pulverized debris thousands of feet into the nighttime sky. The sheer kinetic energy of the continuous aerial bombardment was absolutely terrifying, a testament to the devastating firepower controlled entirely by three exhausted men hiding in the dirt. They were an invisible, lethal conduit connecting the sky to the scorching desert floor. To maintain the dangerous illusion of a much larger attacking force, Captain Thomas aggressively pushed the heavy patrol vehicles to their absolute mechanical limits across the broken terrain. They would speed to a new elevated observation point, designate a series of high-value targets for the bombers, and immediately displace before the enemy could triangulate their exact location. This exhausting, continuous cycle of rapid movement and violent destruction severely tested their driving skills and their physical endurance. Sergeant Miller kept his primary weapon constantly sweeping the dark perimeter, remaining hyper-vigilant for any signs of an organized Iraqi infantry counterattack. The psychological warfare tactics were proving incredibly effective, as intercepted radio transmissions revealed mass confusion and widespread panic rapidly spreading among the high-ranking Iraqi garrison commanders. The defenders genuinely believed they were being systematically dismantled by an overwhelming, multi-directional armored assault, completely unaware that their tormentors were merely a handful of special forces operators. This fabricated chaos allowed the coalition aircraft to operate with absolute impunity, systematically destroying critical infrastructure, defensive anti-aircraft batteries, and heavy troop concentrations within the base. The Australian Phantoms were successfully fighting an entire fortified division utilizing nothing but speed, shadows, and precision bombs. Despite the overwhelming success of the aerial campaign, the sheer scale of the Al Asad airbase presented a continuous, terrifying threat to the incredibly small and isolated reconnaissance patrol. The facility was essentially a sprawling, heavily fortified city in the middle of the desert, housing thousands of highly trained Republican Guard soldiers equipped with heavy mechanized armor. If even a single enemy patrol managed to bypass the bombing zones and visually identify the Australian vehicles, the deception would instantly collapse. The ensuing pursuit would quickly result in the team's brutal, inevitable destruction against the overwhelming numerical superiority of the enemy. Keep our signature minimized, Thomas. The ambient light from these secondary explosions is seriously compromising our visual concealment, Miller warned, shielding his night vision optics from the blinding flashes of burning aviation fuel. The raging inferno inside the base illuminated the surrounding desert landscape, casting long, erratic shadows that made accurate navigation increasingly difficult and incredibly hazardous. The intense heat radiating from the burning facility washed over their exposed vehicles, a stark, uncomfortable reminder of the immense destruction they were actively orchestrating. They pressed forward relentlessly, circling the massive perimeter like a pack of starving, highly coordinated wolves. Recognizing the devastating pattern of the continuous precision airstrikes, the surviving Iraqi artillery commanders desperately attempted to mount a coordinated, aggressive defense against the unseen attackers. A terrifying barrage of heavy mortar fire and unguided artillery shells suddenly began to rain down indiscriminately across the desert landscape surrounding the base perimeter. The deafening whistle of incoming ordnance sent a violent shockwave of pure adrenaline through the exhausted Australian team as massive explosions violently churned the earth around them. The hunters were now effectively trapped in a completely unpredictable, highly lethal downpour of jagged, red-hot military shrapnel. Incoming artillery fire. Violently adjust heading to 090. We need to immediately break contact and find substantial overhead cover, Thomas shouted over the deafening roar of the surrounding explosions. He brutally wrenched the steering wheel, forcing the heavily laden patrol vehicle into a steep, dangerous dive toward a narrow, dry ravine bordering the airfield. The ground shook violently as a massive artillery shell detonated just 50 meters behind their rear axle, showering the open cabin with a terrifying hail of pulverized rock and deadly steel fragments. The protective terrain of the ravine was their only immediate salvation. The steep, jagged walls of the dry canyon offered temporary physical protection from the relentless artillery barrage, but it also effectively funneled the Australian team into a highly dangerous, inescapable geographic bottleneck. The deafening echo of the exploding shells reverberated violently within the narrow rock formation, creating a chaotic, disorienting soundscape that severely hindered their tactical communication. Dust and debris rained down continuously from the canyon rim, coating their weapons and heavily restricting the visibility of their advanced night vision equipment. They were temporarily pinned down, desperately waiting for a pause in the terrifying, overwhelming enemy bombardment. Davies frantically manipulated his complex radio console, desperately attempting to relay the precise coordinates of the active Iraqi artillery batteries to the coalition aircraft loitering high above the battlefield. "I need counter-battery fire on grid reference Echo Tango 7. They have our entire sector completely dialed in," Davies pleaded into the microphone, his voice straining against the deafening noise. The heavy electronic interference created by the massive explosions severely degraded their satellite connection, making it incredibly difficult to maintain a stable, secure transmission link. The survival of the entire team depended entirely on his ability to connect. The intense physical toll of the continuous, high-stress combat operations began to manifest rapidly, severely testing the absolute limits of the operators' mental and physical endurance. They had been operating behind enemy lines for days without adequate sleep, surviving entirely on adrenaline and their deeply ingrained, rigorous special forces training. Every violent jolt of the heavy patrol vehicle, every deafening explosion, incrementally drained their remaining reserves of vital energy and sharp tactical focus. Despite this profound exhaustion, their movements remained incredibly precise, a testament to their unwavering professional discipline in the face of absolute catastrophic danger. "The artillery fire is systematically walking down the length of this canyon. Captain, they are actively attempting to flush us out into the open desert," Miller reported calmly, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgeline. The tactical intelligence of the Iraqi commanders was highly impressive. They were blindly using their heavy guns to actively herd the unseen attackers toward a prepared defensive position. Remaining inside the narrow ravine was no longer a viable survival strategy. It had rapidly transformed into a deadly, inescapable kill zone. They had to abandon their limited cover and completely re-engage the massive enemy force. Thomas slammed the heavy transmission into gear, forcefully accelerating the patrol vehicle out of the shallow depression and back into the violently exploding, chaotic expanse of the open desert. The sudden maneuver immediately exposed them to the terrifying, unpredictable rain of heavy shrapnel, but it crucially allowed them to regain their highly valued tactical mobility. They resumed their erratic, high-speed patrol patterns, desperately trying to visually outmaneuver the incoming artillery shells while simultaneously painting new targets for the circling bombers. It was a deadly, high-stakes game of mechanized cat and mouse played on a massive, highly volatile chessboard. As they rapidly approached the heavily fortified western gate of the sprawling airbase, the intense volume of enemy defensive fire suddenly increased to an absolutely terrifying, unsustainable level. Heavy machine gun tracers violently ripped through the dark night sky, forming a deadly, glowing web of lethal crossfire that directly threatened to instantly shred their lightly armored vehicles. The Iraqi defenders were no longer firing blindly into the desert. They had clearly localized the general direction of the Australian attack and were actively preparing a massive counteroffensive. The carefully constructed deception was beginning to dangerously unravel at the seams. The suffocating dust storm generated by the continuous, massive explosions severely degraded their visual awareness, transforming the battlefield into a chaotic, swirling nightmare of fire and blinding sand. Thomas strained to see through the heavy, abrasive clouds, his knuckles turning completely white as he gripped the steering wheel and desperately tried to maintain their precarious forward momentum. The roaring engines of the patrol vehicles screamed in protest as they violently navigated the crater-filled terrain, dodging massive pieces of burning debris ejected from the devastated military base. They were driving entirely blind into the very heart of the enemy fortress. Multiple heavy mechanized contacts moving aggressively toward the main western perimeter gate, Miller shouted urgently, his powerful thermal optics piercing through the thick, swirling curtain of battlefield dust. The massive steel doors of the base were slowly grinding open, revealing the terrifying silhouette of dozens of heavy Iraqi armored personnel carriers and main battle tanks preparing to violently exit the facility. The enemy garrison had finally decided to launch a massive, coordinated ground assault to actively hunt down and completely destroy the Phantom force tormenting them. The heavily outnumbered Australian team was about to be completely overrun. In that exact, terrifying moment of impending doom, a massive, unguided artillery shell violently impacted the hard desert floor less than 20 meters from the right flank of their rapidly moving vehicle. The resulting shockwave was absolutely catastrophic, instantly lifting the heavy patrol truck completely off the ground and violently slamming it back down with a bone-shattering, metallic crash. A terrifying cloud of jagged, red-hot shrapnel violently tore through the fragile exterior of the vehicle, violently shredding the sensitive electronic equipment and the mounted heavy weapons. The world dissolved into a chaotic, deafening roar of pure, unadulterated violence. The violent kinetic impact forcefully threw Captain Thomas violently against the heavy steering column, momentarily knocking the wind completely out of his lungs and temporarily blinding his vision. He desperately fought through the overwhelming wave of sudden, blinding pain, instinctively maintaining his tight grip on the wheel to prevent the heavy vehicle from violently rolling over in the sand. "Status report. Sound off immediately," Thomas aggressively commanded, his voice a harsh, desperate rasp echoing over the terrifying sound of the actively revving enemy tank engines. The terrifying reality of their desperate situation instantly crashed down upon his exhausted mind. Sergeant Miller quickly responded from the passenger seat, his face completely covered in a thick layer of gray dust, but miraculously free of any immediate, severe physical injuries. He immediately swung his primary weapon toward the rapidly opening gates, preparing to desperately engage the overwhelming wall of enemy armor, actively pouring out into the open desert. The terrifying rumble of the heavy Iraqi tank treads vividly shook the ground beneath them, a terrifying prelude to the massive, violent execution rapidly approaching their severely damaged position. They were completely exposed, effectively immobilized, and entirely out of viable tactical options. The thick, choking dust slowly began to clear, revealing a highly terrifying, apocalyptic tableau of heavily armed Iraqi military vehicles aggressively charging directly toward their fragile, completely exposed position. "Davies, I need that immediate air support right now. Drop everything directly on our current coordinates," Thomas screamed violently, realizing that a highly dangerous, close proximity strike was their only remaining hope. A terrifying, heavy silence followed his desperate command, completely devoid of the familiar, reassuring sound of the corporal's rapid, highly professional radio transmissions. The captain abruptly turned his head toward the rear compartment, his heart completely freezing. Through the thick, swirling smoke and the chaotic debris of the shattered communications console, Thomas saw Corporal Davies violently slumped completely forward over the completely destroyed radio equipment. The young operator's body remained entirely motionless, his tactical helmet resting heavily against the sparking, completely ruined metal chassis of the primary satellite transmission unit. A massive piece of jagged artillery shrapnel had violently pierced the rear armor plate, completely severing their only remaining vital lifeline to the coalition air support network. The Phantom Patrol was now completely deaf, entirely blind, and completely alone against an entire mechanized army. The deafening, mechanical roar of the approaching Iraqi armored column completely drowned out all other sounds in the desert as dozens of heavy enemy vehicles aggressively accelerated toward the crippled Australian truck. The blinding headlights of the massive tanks violently pierced the thick battlefield dust, brightly illuminating the desperately trapped special operations team in a terrifying, inescapable spotlight of impending, absolute death. Captain Thomas aggressively raised his heavily suppressed rifle, tightly bracing his exhausted body against the completely shattered frame of the patrol vehicle. The Phantom deception had finally ended, violently giving way to a desperate, completely suicidal last stand. The suffocating despair of their impending destruction was abruptly shattered by a blinding flash of pure, celestial violence descending from the blackened sky above them. Corporal Davies, though severely concussed and bleeding heavily from his shrapnel wound, had miraculously managed to transmit their final, desperate coordinates mere milliseconds before the radio violently died. A pair of coalition strike aircraft, loitering completely undetected at 30,000 feet, immediately responded to the automated distress signal by unleashing their heavy payloads directly onto the rapidly advancing Iraqi armored column. The hunters were suddenly shielded by a massive, impenetrable wall of exploding ordnance. Captain Thomas instinctively shielded his face as the devastating shockwaves from the precision airstrikes violently rocked their crippled patrol vehicle back and forth across the sand. The leading elements of the massive enemy mechanized force were instantly vaporized in a terrifying, synchronized eruption of churning earth and violently twisting metallic wreckage. Secondary explosions continuously ripped through the night as fully loaded Iraqi ammunition carriers catastrophically detonated, sending massive, deadly fireballs rolling aggressively across the scorched desert floor. The overwhelming auditory assault was absolutely paralyzing, temporarily rendering the exhausted Australian operators completely deaf amidst the chaotic, raging battlefield inferno. Sergeant Miller immediately capitalized on the chaotic destruction, aggressively pulling the severely injured communications specialist from the smoking wreckage of the rear compartment. "Davies is still breathing, Captain." The shrapnel caught his heavy ceramic trauma plate, but the kinetic impact has completely knocked him out. Miller shouted hoarsely over the deafening roar of the burning enemy tanks. Thomas felt a massive, overwhelming surge of profound relief briefly wash over his exhausted mind, quickly transitioning back to the terrifying reality of their incredibly precarious tactical situation. The entire Iraqi garrison was still actively mobilizing just beyond the wall of fire. However, the devastating pinpoint accuracy of the coalition air support had fundamentally broken the fighting spirit of the surviving Iraqi military commanders coordinating the base defense. From their perspective, the sheer volume of continuous, highly destructive ordnance falling perfectly upon their advancing armor could only be directed by a massive, overwhelming ground force. The carefully orchestrated psychological warfare campaign had reached its absolute climax, successfully convincing the entrenched defenders that an entire Allied armored division had completely surrounded their sprawling facility. Panic rapidly infected the enemy ranks as terrified soldiers began abandoning their heavy vehicles to seek immediate cover. Through the thick, swirling smoke and the violently dancing shadows of the burning wreckage, Thomas observed a highly unexpected, profoundly surreal shift in the enemy's aggressive posture. The deafening, rhythmic clanking of the approaching tank treads abruptly stopped, replaced by the frantic, chaotic shouting of Iraqi officers desperately trying to maintain discipline. Suddenly, a massive, starkly white piece of fabric was slowly raised above the heavily fortified western gate, illuminated brightly by the surrounding, catastrophic fires of the destroyed armor. The Iraqi garrison at the sprawling Al-Assad airbase was officially signaling their complete, unconditional battlefield surrender. The sudden, deafening silence that rapidly settled over the devastated battlefield was incredibly jarring, a stark, terrifying contrast to the relentless violence of the preceding hours. Thomas and Miller remained completely motionless, their weapons still heavily trained on the distant gates, highly suspicious of a potential, devastating enemy deception tactic. "Hold your fire and maintain absolute visual security. This could easily be a trap to draw us out into the open ground," Thomas whispered strictly, his eyes continuously scanning the dark horizon. The overwhelming adrenaline that had sustained them for days was finally beginning to dangerously rapidly recede. Slowly, hundreds of Iraqi soldiers began to emerge from the heavily fortified bunkers and defensive trenches, leaving their primary weapons carefully placed on the scorched earth. They walked forward with their hands raised high above their heads, their faces painted with a profound mixture of sheer terror and absolute, crushing defeat. The enemy commanders actively expected to surrender to a massive, heavily armed coalition battalion, completely unaware that their devastating conquerors were merely 3 exhausted men in a broken truck. The psychological illusion carefully crafted by the Australian Phantoms had successfully defeated an entire, heavily fortified, mechanized division. Recognizing that the immediate threat had finally passed, the isolated Australian team quickly shifted their intense focus to the urgent medical stabilization of their wounded comrade. Miller expertly applied a tight pressure dressing to the severe laceration on Davies's head, carefully monitoring the unconscious corporal's vital signs in the harsh, flickering light. "He needs immediate medical evacuation. Captain, we cannot properly treat this severe concussion in the middle of a highly unsecured, chaotic enemy surrender zone," the sergeant reported grimly. Their heavily damaged patrol vehicle was completely immobilized, leaving them entirely stranded in the highly exposed western desert. Fortunately, the final transmission that had successfully triggered the devastating airstrikes had also alerted the approaching conventional coalition forces to their exact, highly compromised geographic location. The low, unmistakable thumping of heavy transport helicopters rapidly approached from the eastern horizon, signaling the highly anticipated arrival of the primary Allied invasion spearhead. Thomas utilized a specialized infrared strobe light to silently guide the massive aircraft toward their concealed position, ensuring they remained completely hidden from the surrendering Iraqi forces. The conventional military machine was finally arriving to officially claim the massive victory secretly orchestrated by the invisible special operators. A heavily armed team of elite combat medics quickly disembarked from the hovering helicopter, rushing forward to rapidly secure the injured corporal and prepare him for extraction. Thomas and Miller provided a concise, highly professional tactical briefing to the incoming conventional commanders, detailing the exact disposition of the surrendering enemy garrison. They carefully avoided revealing the incredibly small size of their operational element, strictly maintaining the vital illusion of a much larger, highly coordinated special reconnaissance network. Their deeply ingrained professional discipline demanded absolute secrecy, ensuring their specific, highly classified tactical methods remained completely protected from public knowledge. As the conventional infantry units rapidly moved forward to officially secure the massive airbase, the Australian operators began their rigorous, incredibly meticulous post-mission cleanup procedures. They utilized a heavy winch system attached to the extraction helicopter to completely recover their crippled patrol vehicle, ensuring no highly sensitive military hardware was left behind. Every single spent brass casing, every discarded piece of tactical equipment, and every distinct tire track was carefully gathered or deliberately swept away by the exhausted men. They operated with a profound, almost religious devotion to their strict protocol, entirely erasing any physical evidence of their presence. The surrendering Iraqi soldiers watched in utter bewilderment as the massive coalition helicopters aggressively descended upon the battlefield, officially marking the end of their military resistance. They scanned the dark desert continuously, desperately searching for the massive Allied armored division that had relentlessly pounded their heavily fortified positions into absolute, burning submission. They would never discover that the terrifying, highly destructive force they had actively fought was nothing more than a carefully constructed, highly lethal phantom haunting the desert. The humiliating truth of their massive defeat by 3 isolated men would remain permanently hidden from the official historical records. With their severely injured comrades safely secured aboard the medical evacuation helicopter and their heavily damaged equipment fully recovered, Thomas and Miller prepared to finally depart. They stood silently on the edge of the shallow, rocky ravine, looking back at the massive, sprawling military facility they had systematically brought to its knees. The raging fires inside the compound continued to violently burn, casting a terrifying, hellish glow over the completely shattered remains of the once powerful Iraqi garrison. It was a monumental, strategic triumph that would fundamentally alter the entire trajectory of the massive Middle Eastern military campaign. Yet, there would be no public medals awarded for this incredible achievement, no glorious parades, and absolutely no official recognition of their immense, highly dangerous sacrifice. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment operated strictly within the dark, heavily classified margins of modern warfare, performing impossible, highly lethal tasks that officially never happened. Their ultimate reward was merely the quiet, deeply personal satisfaction of successfully completing a vital mission and ensuring their brothers survived the chaotic brutality of the battlefield. They were the silent, invisible architects of victory, purposely fading into the shadows the moment the conventional armies finally arrived. The heavy transport helicopter slowly lifted off the scorched desert floor, the powerful downwash forcefully scattering the remaining loose sand over their carefully swept operational area. As the aircraft banked sharply toward the eastern sunrise, Captain Thomas closed his exhausted eyes, the heavy, paralyzing weight of the previous days finally crushing him. The brutal, unforgiving western Iraqi desert remained exactly as it had been before their secret, highly destructive arrival, silent, indifferent, and completely devoid of human signatures. The Australian Phantoms had successfully completed their impossible mission, vanishing completely into the turbulent pages of unwritten, highly classified military history. The historical narrative of the massive coalition invasion would prominently feature the dramatic, highly televised armored thrusts directly toward the deeply entrenched heart of the capital. Journalists would enthusiastically document the rapid, overwhelming advance of the conventional infantry battalions, capturing the dramatic, highly visible moments of intense combat for the global audience. Official military historians would meticulously map out the grand strategic maneuvers, attributing the rapid collapse of the defensive network to overwhelming technological superiority and massive firepower. The complex, highly nuanced reality of the conflict's initial, extremely precarious hours would purposely remain entirely obscured from the public eye. In truth, those massive, highly celebrated armored columns were only able to confidently advance because the invisible path had already been violently cleared by the phantoms. The critical intelligence gathered under the constant threat of immediate execution had successfully neutralized the terrifying, strategic threat of the mobile ballistic missile launch platforms. The audacious, highly aggressive deception tactics employed at the sprawling airbase had effectively removed an entire, heavily fortified enemy division from the active tactical equation. Without these incredibly dangerous, completely unacknowledged operations, the ensuing conventional war would have undoubtedly been significantly longer and far more intensely bloody. Decades later, deeply buried within the highly classified, heavily redacted archives of the international intelligence community, a few cryptic operational reports might briefly hint at their presence. Military analysts holding the highest possible security clearances might occasionally whisper about an incredibly audacious, highly lethal reconnaissance patrol operating deep behind the fortified enemy lines. However, the specific, profoundly human details of their incredible suffering, their agonizing moral dilemmas, and their ultimate, silent triumph would remain permanently locked completely away. The true, unvarnished history of the Western Desert Campaign belongs exclusively to the men who actively bled into its unforgiving sands. Captain Thomas eventually retired from the demanding, highly secretive world of special operations, carrying the heavy, invisible scars of his deeply classified military service in absolute silence. He seamlessly reintegrated into ordinary civilian life, never once mentioning the terrifying, earth-shattering nights spent hunting mobile missile platforms or orchestrating massive, highly destructive aerial bombardments. When casual acquaintances occasionally asked about his extensive military deployments, he would politely offer vague, remarkably unremarkable anecdotes about routine logistical planning and endless administrative tasks. The profound, terrifying magnitude of his actual wartime experiences remained completely isolated within his highly disciplined, strictly heavily guarded mind. Corporal Davies successfully recovered from his severe battlefield injuries, though the massive kinetic trauma left him with a permanent, subtle tremor in his left hand. He transitioned into a highly technical, deeply classified role within the military intelligence apparatus, utilizing his incredible electronic warfare expertise to support future clandestine operations. He understood deeply that the survival of the modern warfighter heavily depended on the invisible, highly secure digital networks he now tirelessly designed and rigorously maintained. The terrifying memory of that completely shattered radio console in the desert constantly fueled his intense, unwavering dedication to his crucial work. Sergeant Miller remained fiercely committed to the regiment, dedicating the remainder of his highly decorated career to rigorously training the next generation of elite Australian operators. He incorporated the brutal, unforgiving lessons learned during that impossible, highly classified mission directly into the incredibly demanding, deeply exhaustive tactical curriculum of the Special Forces. He constantly emphasized the vital importance of absolute discipline, profound psychological endurance, and the deeply ethical complexities inherent in modern, highly irregular, asymmetric warfare environments. His legacy was actively forged in the extraordinary competence of the unseen warriors he meticulously prepared for the darkness. The legend of the Australian Phantoms quietly endures as a powerful, unspoken testament to the extraordinary capabilities of highly trained individuals facing absolute, catastrophic adversity. Their incredibly successful mission unequivocally proves that the profound courage of a few isolated men can effectively alter the violent trajectory of massive international conflicts. The vast, scorching Iraqi desert silently guards the ultimate truth of their deeply classified actions, an eternal, completely unforgiving monument to their extreme dedication and ultimate sacrifice. They remain the invisible guardians of history, forever holding the line in the terrifying, completely silent shadows of war.